All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today is Chris Michael. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
It is so good to have you. Chris has done a lot of things. In preparing for this podcast, I connected with our friend Ann Dwane, your great friend Ann Dwane, and she said something to me like in a moment in passing. She probably didn't think about it, but she said, "Life is meant to be lived in chapters." And I'm sure someone else has said that before, Ann Dwane, but I don't know. That is really stuck with me. And boy, your life has had a couple chapters. You have been in the military. You flew in the Navy. You were a board member of Dale Carnegie. You went to Harvard Business School and University of Illinois. Too many boards to name. You built and sold at least one company, two companies, and now you are a photographer.
And I was in venture briefly.
Yeah, yes.
Maybe I am in venture.
Briefly.
Maybe I am in venture in case you're a portfolio company.
Exactly. I want to start with.
That's sort of three big things. I think three big chapters.
I'm curious about the military chapter. You flew planes for the military, right?
Yep. I was a navigator and mission commander on P-3 Orions, and hunting drug runners and
submarines, right?
Yeah.
So can I take a guess? Did you see Top Gun and then go sign up for the military?
In fact, I did.
That is so funny.
Yeah.
So I, in the 80s, I saw the movie Top Gun, and the Navy recruiter guys would be at the movie back then. You walk out of the movie, right? You're like, hey. And so I went to the thing. I'm going to fly planes. Like, that's pretty cool. And they checked my eyes and like, oh, you can't be a pilot. They're not 2020, but you can be a Rio.
Yeah.
Like, what's a Rio? Like, the guy who sits
it's like Goose.
It's Goose. I'm like, forget that. If I can't
Goose dies in the movie.
Yeah. I'm like, forget that. But I'm struck at being in the military. All my friends who've been in the military, and to be fair, they've been doctors and pilots and not in combat. So we're not talking combat infantry, but have had speak very fondly of very positively of their experience. What do you make of your?
Well, that's a really well-timed question because I'm working on a major 3-year photo journalism project called Uniform Identity, which is really to kind of highlight the stories of people serving in the military today. And because my experience is kind of what you just articulated, which is, I've met many, many military people. In fact, my first company, military.com, is the largest military membership organization. And my experience, almost without exception, is people had a positive experience. That's not to say there isn't tragedy. There isn't a problem with suicides. We don't have people that have PTSD. We don't have people that have been killed or injured. We don't have families struggling. All of those things are real, but they're not representative of most people's experiences. Most people really enjoyed their time in the military. In fact, they enjoyed it so much, we built a whole company based on this idea. The things we're involved in when we come of age are increasingly important in our lives, music, clothing, whatever it might be. And the military is a very diverse, interesting place with people who have purpose. And they're with other people similar age working on something bigger than themselves. And that could be the mission of the country, it could be a particular operation, but mostly it's the unit that you're with. And this is a powerful idea. And in a sense, I found this a little bit in my startups, that we can all come together around a purpose. But my experience was altogether positive in the military. I loved it.
And you moved from the military to, you didn't move from the military. You were in the military as a pilot.
As a navigator.
And then you were in...
I was Goose, but I survived.
Exactly. Did you have did anything dramatic ever happen?
Yeah.
Did you encounter anybody? Did you get into...
Did I encounter anyone?
Or danger of any kind?
Yeah, I've had all of those things happen. I don't know about the encounters, but they after I finished military.com, they wrote a book about the company, or at least a third of a book about the company, and the book starts off with my plane almost crashing.
Whoa.
And in fact, it sort of crashed. So I've had incidents in the air. We think we've been fired upon. I'm not 100% certain. I lived at CIA bases in Central America, hunting drug runners. I saw a lot of interesting things.
You know some stuff.
And then I went to work in the Pentagon for the senior admiral that flew my kind of aircraft.
Yeah.
And, my level of interest in business was zero. I never took a business class in college. I never read a business publication. I didn't care about that. I cared about national security. I cared about politics. I thought I wanted to be a politician. And in fact, I saw a movie when I was in the Navy called The Paper Chase. Do you might remember this movie?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a book by this guy, John J. Osborne. And I saw this, and it was about going to Harvard Law School. And the first scene in the movie is they're in there, and John Houseman, who's the contracts professor, says, you come in here with your brains filled with mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer. And I remember driving from Maine down to Harvard, wishing that maybe one day I could go to Harvard Law School. And through a kind of unusual turn of events, I got accepted to Harvard Business School, which was quite different.
Yeah.
And especially for somebody not interested in business. And I was lucky because I think they appreciate military service. And that sort of kicked off a whole set of activities in my life around entrepreneurship that just was not on the roadmap.
Right. Now, prior to that, but you went to the University of Illinois.
Yeah.
Which is such a fascinating thing because Silicon Valley is filled with people who went to one of three schools, Harvard, Stanford, and then kind of there's a Princeton thing. U of I is in the cornfields in the middle of Illinois, and some of the most extraordinary people in Silicon Valley somehow made their way through there. Guys like Max Levchin, Mark Andreessen.
Lots of people.
What the heck is it that is going on there, was going on there? What made that happen?
Well, it's interesting because what we didn't talk about was that my unusual childhood, I moved 8 or 9 times growing up, was filled with technology. So my great joy, so I wasn't popular in school, I was a super nerd. I was programming computers in the late 70s.
Oh, what was your first computer?
My first computer that I owned was the Sinclair ZX80. Yeah. So that's 1979. And in fact, I was taking college classes when I was in high school. So I was that quintessential early computer programmer nerd. I lived in Illinois. And so the best school that I could probably get into was the University of Illinois. So at that time, the University of Illinois was important in technology. It was in the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. But I'm old enough, so I started college in, 85. And computers were different then. People were using punch cards. It was, so I wasn't a computer science major. But that was happening there. This was the formative years around building a school that would be maybe the most important around internet technologies. I mean, the browser came out of Illinois.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. I mean, I think if you went there and you were an engineer, I was not an engineer at Illinois, it's the 1/3 or 4th engineering school in the country.
Sure.
So that's an element of this, which is it's so hard to get into. They're so good. And once a few people graduate and are successful, it creates a kind of pathway for other people to follow them.
Right.
So I think if I'm successful, I don't know that I am, but if I am, I think it's random sort of that I went to Illinois, but I observe the same thing you do, which is that school has a disproportionate number of successful entrepreneurs.
And Mark Andreessen, I forget where he grew up, somewhere in Minnesota, Wisconsin. And he just said he went there because he looked at the salaries and engineering was the highest. And then the best schools were like MIT, Harvard, and Illinois. And he said in the world he grew up in, there was no concept of going to MIT or Harvard.
Yeah.
Like it was not available to someone of his stature.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting he says that because I had the same view. I never knew anyone that went to those schools. Yeah. That wasn't even something I considered. And, this is an important idea that I've thought about. I later on was invited to Tom Siebel's house. And Tom went to Illinois. And and there was an engineer there who had gotten his PhD at Stanford, and he got his undergraduate at Illinois. And he said, my education at Stanford was not better than at Illinois, but the difference was, and this was a while ago, 15 years ago, he said the difference was my expectations were different. At Illinois, a good engineer went to work at Motorola.
Sure.
And at Stanford, a good engineer went and started Google or went to Google
Right,
or something.
Right.
So those expectations, by the way, have changed not just for Illinois. They've changed a long time ago for Illinois, but they're changing for a lot of people all over the world because we now have role models that look like they could be achievable goals for us.
Right.
So you can look at Mark Zuckerberg and say, I'm a young person, I'm smart, I can do what he did. And that's a cool thing. So expectations do matter in our lives.
Right. You just have to be able to imagine it to do it.
Correct.
At some point.
Correct. And this is one of the nice things about the internet is we have lots of role models.
Yeah. So you come to Harvard, not as Harvard Business School, not as many people I talk to do, which is, I went to Princeton and I grew up in Connecticut. I mean, you came from the military from a Midwestern Big Ten school, not actually maybe thinking Harvard Business School was your lifelong dream. And here you are surrounded by who? Like what kind of people?
Well, it's a very interesting question. So basically imagine I'm working in the Pentagon and I'm in uniform and I, don't have a lot of money. I resign my commission. I'm doing quite well. I'm working for this admiral and I resign my commission. So basically I take a good career path and I end it. Yeah. I don't have any money really, and I get some student loans, and I have the GI Bill.
Yeah, right.
And I drive to Boston, and I think I sold my car. Maybe I got to Boston, and I move into a dorm room. So I'm 29 years old, and all the other people that were 28 or 29 were horrified that they were having to move into a dorm room. And I was thinking, well, my next duty station would be a ship, and at least I have my own bathroom. So I was feeling quite happy. Yeah. And I remember just showing up in the first day of class, and you get assigned. I got assigned to the it's called the worm deck, which is the lowest or the first row. And I'm sitting next to, I have really short hair, and I'm sitting next to Sergio Monsalve. Do you know Sergio from Norwest? And but he wasn't from Norwest then. He was a banker. And a guy named Amar Singh, who's a very successful entrepreneur in India, and he's a Sikh. So basically, I was sitting next to a guy with a turban. So this is before all these wars. I didn't know anyone in a turban, and this banker. And it's a bell grading curve at Harvard, and they teach you nothing specifically because it's the case method. And the first thing that happens in the first class is both of these two people who are sitting on either side of me stand up and salute me and say, "Good morning, sir."
Are they being smart asses?
Yeah, they're being smart asses. And I was like, "Oh, geez, this is going to be tough."
That's funny. You thought they were the weird looking guys.
Well,
and they're like, "You're the weird looking."
Yeah, I was feeling a little self conscious, and basically in my class were, not just my section, but my class were like princes and many, many people that basically had lived a kind of predestined life for this kind of success. And this, as I said, this wasn't even on my pathway. I wasn't alone. There were, I would say, 15% of the class that probably were like me in some way, that were a little bit like outsiders. But you meet a class of people who live in Greenwich, Connecticut, whose parents are CEOs of companies that
or are literal princes.
Yes, there was actually a guy, Max, who came in with his name tag. My name tag said Christopher Michael. His name tag said Maximilian, and the next day it said Max Liechtenstein. And I said, "Oh, you're from Liechtenstein, so they just put your country's name." He's like, "No, they gave the country my name." Maybe he didn't say that exactly, but something like that. And I was like, "Wow, that's interesting." And you realize that this, when we talk about class differences, this is a material point, which is who you're around influences what you think you should do or what you expect or what you know about. I showed up at business school thinking McKinsey was a Scottish guy, right? And
everyone else was aspiring to work at McKinsey or Bain or Goldman Sachs.
Right. So this has been a useful experience. It was a useful experience in my life. It was very, very hard for me because I had to teach myself accounting. They don't teach you. So imagine you go into your first accounting class, bell grading curve. They kick out the bottom people in class, and they're like, restate the financials for 3 years for this company. Yeah. Well, you've never heard anyone say restate financials. Right. Even the language was unusual. And so basically every night when my classmates were out doing fun things, I was studying to make sure I didn't get thrown out of business school. But this has been it was a useful mechanism for me in a lot of ways. The most important was just to be aware of what I don't know about. And when I was in the military, I was quite successful in the military, and I thought I knew a lot of things. Yeah. And I realized that there were a lot of things I knew nothing about. Yeah. And it turns out, obviously, that this is true in a lot of areas. And, all of us in Silicon Valley, we are very, very tuned into the hyper nuances of the startup world. But there's many, many other worlds out there that are equally important or more important, and that we are not aware of and we're not sensitive to, and they matter.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've had conversations where I'll go talk to my friends. I'm just going to Chicago, and they're working in Chicago in some insurance company that they own. I mean, they're doing very well. But you'll start talking to them about, like so-and-so, he's the guy who started Okta or whatever. They have no idea what you're talking about. Like, they kind of know Facebook and they know a couple of the things. But you'll name a couple rock star venture capitalists. And they'll be like, what is that? Like, who is that? I don't know who that is. Yeah. So we're definitely in a bubble here.
Yeah. I mean, it's getting a lot more attention today than it did, 20 years ago. There were a few VCs. People knew a little bit about entrepreneurship. I'm not certain I'd ever use that word until I was I don't know, 27, 28.
Yeah, I went to Northwestern. We had to Kellogg, the business school there, which is, they don't kick people out like Harvard. It's pretty fun.
I heard they're very nice.
It's super nice. It's super great. You know what they do? It's a marketing school. So everything is like a survey of the students. So if a professor isn't well surveyed by the students, for example, like they leave. So it's not the brutal environment of.
Well, I don't know. I mean, to some extent, they have created this sort of system. But the truth about Harvard, and I went to work there as an entrepreneur in residence, is that they're a very kind and gentle place. The environment in the classroom is actually kind of very supportive, but also has this edge. And I'm a fan of some of the edge, not all of it. Some of it just pushes, especially if it's Socratic method and class participation matters. If you are a professor there, one of the things that you're very good at is getting a lot of people to work hard, of a variety of levels. So let's say you worked at McKinsey before business school and you know all of these things. How do you get someone like that to really push themselves? And the way you do that is you ask them uncomfortable questions. Yeah. And it works. And it pushes people. And, for at least some period of time, as people are a little bit nervous, it's amazing what they're able to do.
Yeah, we would have these entrepreneurship classes at Northwestern. And they're really funny because they'd bring in some guy who everybody was jealous of. He had 5 boats and he was really rich and really successful. And everyone would ask him for advice. And his advice, it was always a guy, it would be like, I don't know, learn accounting and sales and then drop out of school and go get started. So it was all this advice. Wow. It was this advice that nobody wanted to hear.
What year did you graduate?
It was like the 95 or something like that. Uh-huh. And so it was this advice that people didn't want. They wanted to hear, well, go to McKinsey and then, start something. And he was like, well, I don't know. I dropped out of high school and I wish I knew more about accounting and just do it. And everyone's like, oh, that sounds hard. And then they went to work at McKinsey and didn't become entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So how do you animate your way out west?
Well, by the way, do you want to hear how Anne figures into the story?
Yeah.
It's kind of a surprising
component
of this. So I was working for an admiral as the admiral's aide. So my job as the admiral's aide is to travel with the admiral to make sure everything is working well for the admiral. He had about 200,000 people working for him. Okay. So I was like the assistant to the CEO. Right. And that could mean I'm getting him coffee, or it could mean that I'm arranging some trip, or it could be more strategic, but I did everything. And the admiral had 60 reserve admirals working for him. And one of those reserve admirals is a really cool guy. Reserve admiral means 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, but more than that because they put in more time than that. And they have other jobs. So one of the points of inspiration for me is I met these people who are like CEOs of companies or airline pilots, and they were admirals. And one of them was a guy named Hank White. And Hank White was a really interesting Naval Academy guy who went on to he was the executive director of the American Bar Association, somebody really interesting. Anyway, I was about to leave to go to business school, and I met this admiral, and he said, oh, my niece is going to Harvard Business School, and if you're nice to me, I'll introduce you. He was kidding about being nice to him. He was a really cool guy. Anyway, he introduces me to this woman named Anne. And we had the Facebook, which was a little book, and I looked at Anne, and Anne's in there. Anne always says, she looked at me, and she said I looked really young and strange. So now I'm just older and strange, but then I was young and strange. And I called Anne on the phone because, back then, I don't know, I guess you could do email, but phone was what you did. And I had a kind of okay conversation with Anne. It seemed a little awkward, whatever. I show up at business school, and I'm like moving into my dorm room, and I see this young, pretty woman moving her stuff into the dorm room, and I'm like, I don't know who it is. And I just go up to her and I say, can I help you? And I start moving these boxes. And in about 4 minutes, I realized this is the woman that I'd spoken to 3 months earlier. And it's Anne. So I move all my stuff into her dorm room, and I'm like, oh, that was great. And we meet for coffee or something. And there's something that happens at the beginning of Harvard Business School, which is very stressful to the outsiders, and that is the formation of study groups. I hear they're now assigned. I heard something about that. I don't know if it's true. But who's in your study group seemed to matter, or people thought that it mattered. And Anne was hooked up into this really great study group. And I think she said, I'll join your study group if you bring along Chris. And so Anne was in my study group. So basically, Anne and I worked very, very hard on our cases together. And Anne takes stuff very seriously, too. And she helped me a lot. And second year, we helped start a biotech company. Well, we actually joined with some professors, and then we helped start this thing called Initio Pharmaceuticals, which ended up going nowhere. And Anne and I were really best friends. And we drove across country together. She gave me my first camera.
Wow.
Can you believe that? She gave me a Kodak Advantix camera. And we came out here, and I had always wanted to be in it. I mean, I'm the techie of the two of us, the nerd. Right. And I was ending up working at Mercer Management Consulting with Gil Pinchina, the first person I met when I came to San Francisco. Gil, who was a partner or associate there. And so I'm working in consulting, not happy about it. And Anne has the best startup job ever. She's working for Paul Allen at Interval Research Corporation.
Wow.
Which was like the super advanced, Google X of its day. And anyway, and then she ended up going to a startup. And so she was living that life. And I really wanted to come up with an entrepreneurial idea, and then eventually came up with military.com, and she helped me do that. And
now, we'll get to why this matters in a moment, but why did Anne give you a camera of all things?
I don't know. Because we're driving cross country, maybe it was, but I wasn't that interested in photography. It wasn't like,
right.
It's funny about how small things can make a big difference, like that movie. Remember I was telling you about the paper test? I didn't give you the postscript on that. The postscript on that movie is I would often tell people in new hire orientation about this. And one day this kid raises his hand and he said, I have something to say. And I said, what is it, Sam? And he said, my father wrote that book. And I was like, wow, that's incredible.
Wow.
And then 2 weeks later, I'm with my friend Tom Patterson, and we're out and we meet this girl at some Irish pub. And I'm telling her, I don't know her, and I'm telling her the story. She said, well, I have something to say. I said, what's that? She said, well, that's my brother. My father wrote this book, and I've become good friends with John.
Yeah.
In fact, just photographed him for the back cover of his new book. Wow. So, a lot of these small things where you think maybe aren't that important could turn out to be.
Well, in small things, you could have walked by Anne every day for business school if you hadn't been in the Navy and had somebody make that connection. I mean, it's not...
Well, I wouldn't probably be an entrepreneur today or a photographer if it wasn't for Anne. So she gets...
she gets credit for at least 2 chapters.
She gets... she might get credit for it all. So.
Right. So how do you come to form military.com with her?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's see. So as I said, I was in the unenviable position now. So I was inspired at business school to become an entrepreneur. It was, in fact, I went to regular class. By the way, if you'd asked me what it is that you should do when I was at business school, I would have said, well, I was thinking about my military experience, so maybe something in operations, because maybe I'm a military person. So people often do this to themselves is they put themselves in a box and they look at what they've done in the past and they draw a straight line between the 2 dots and they see where they'll end up in the future. And I think it's an incredible mistake. And we can talk more about that if you're interested. But
I think there's also, something I've always observed is that people in college have this view of there being, at least when I went to school, like 4 jobs in the world. Like, there's kind of like lawyer, doctor, consultant, astronaut. There's a very small number of jobs that they conceive. And then you meet people in the world who have these extraordinary jobs that you never even knew there was a business.
Yeah. Yeah, we're back to inspiration, right? Who do we meet? And I went to this class. I didn't think anything of it, but the person that was the guest in our class is a guy named Dan Bricklin. Do you know what Dan did?
Yeah.
Dan did something pretty important. So Dan was an MIT student, and then he went to Harvard Business School, and then this is, I guess, 1980, maybe 79, and he doesn't like the way they're doing accounting. It's basically you're filling out like a spreadsheet on paper. And he invents the digital spreadsheet, and it's a company called VisiCorp, and their first product is VisiCalc. And VisiCalc becomes one of the 3 applications that drive the adoption of the personal computer. Anyway, he's talking to us.
And by the way, a lot of people say change the M&A market because you could now do a kind of analysis on companies that you didn't used to be able to do so fastly. So.
It's hard to really say all of the implications. But what he said was I eventually was put out of business. And, I don't think it was a big financial success. But he said, I look back at my life and I realized I built something that mattered. And that idea was an important idea for me. And I thought that building things that mattered would be important. And so I had this idea to be an entrepreneur. Anyway, I was finished business school. My startup had failed. And I meet many people like this. They know they want to be entrepreneurs, but they don't know what the idea is. Mm-hmm. And I was still in the reserves, and I was at a reserve drill weekend. This is 1999. And people were complaining. This is now 5 years before Facebook. People are complaining about getting access to their benefits. People were also asking me if I knew different people in different units. And it really hit me that the internet would be a great way to connect, enable, and empower the military, which is broadly 20 million people, active duty 2.4 million people. So it's a big group. And so basically, your partner is somebody that created one of the first social networks. Military.com was also one of the first social networks. So we had this idea that the internet, because we'd seen some of these things, that the internet might be a great way to connect people. And so basically we built Military as the kind of Facebook, or we built Military.com as the Facebook for the military community.
Right. And it was all smooth sailing. You started it, it grew, and you sold it.
It was just that easy. I mean, it's like, that's easy button. I just hit that button and it was just cash was just flowing in.
What was the, I'm sure there was a difficult moment before it.
Do you know, I mean, have we talked about, did I ever give like a little, because I give a talk on, it's called Lessons from the Edge. Basically, it's just about how hard it was in military. Do you know much about that?
I think you may have told me, but people have two different ways that they go on this when they have a difficult time in their company. Some people are traumatized by it or have PTSD and kind of, everyone's kind of traumatized by it. Some people talk about it, and some people write it out of their history, and everything was just a glorious ride to the top.
Oh, yeah. Well, the single
the former is more interesting.
The single best. I mean, I've been involved in your entrepreneurial story, and you've earned your stripes. You've been there.
It's bruising.
And I'll if you'll indulge me for 3 minutes, I'll tell you the story. But basically, we have this idea for Military.com. I enlist Anne, and I hire one of my partners from my venture or from my consulting firm, and we have this company, Military.com, Military Advantage. I have no money. I owe like $100,000 to Harvard, and I basically start trying to put a company together, and I get a lawyer, and it's a good lawyer, and he introduces me to some VCs. It was back in the day, and I remember my first VC meeting. I think it was Sigma, and I went down there, and like I had Anne, and I had my friend, my co-founder Brad Clark, and then I had a couple other people that were like sort of employed at the company. I think all of us actually, or maybe most of those people already had other jobs. These people that have like other jobs, but if you get funded. Yeah. Anyway, so I give this pitch on, I'd worked in consulting for 1 year, so I could do a PowerPoint presentation. I did this PowerPoint presentation all about the military, and I swear those people like didn't say anything. It was just like, 6 older white guys just looking at us. Yeah. My first VC meeting. And by the way, I thought Sand Hill Road was like a road that was hilly with sand. Yeah. So when I went there and saw that it wasn't like that, it was surprising. And they might all still be sitting in that room. I mean, it was really a weird...
Or some version of them.
Yes. It was a really weird meeting. Like, I didn't feel good about it. And basically, we went out to raise money. And this is 1999. So people talk about it as so easy to raise money. It was the height of the dot-com world. Well, there were a lot of startups, I guess. And basically, I had a bunch of bad meetings. And it wasn't working. And I almost quit. And... fortunately, I ran into a guy named Mike Leventhal at Mayfield, which was at the time one of the best venture firms in the world, and it's still a very good venture firm. But at the time, it was like 1 or 2 or 3 or something. And he gave us $5 million. I remember taking pictures of the check, and we started to build the website. And it cost $4 million. We're talking to Viant and Scient and NextGenix and all these people. We built this website.
Big companies back in the day who would charge you a ton of money to build a website. They kind of make you pitch them.
Yes, exactly. That was it. So we hired a lot of people. We because Mayfield invested. Now David Liddell, Ann's old boss at U.S. Venture Partners, gives us like another $15 million, and History Channel gives us money. So basically, we went from like nobody wanted to talk to us because we're some military startup to it being kind of a hot company. And then in March of 2000, the site launches. So we're coming up on our 20-year anniversary of the launch. And we're actually just planning our 20-year anniversary. I remember USA Today comes out to do like a cover story. And then we get the VCs, and they like have a photographer, and we go around and take all these photos. And then the article comes out, and it's not the article I expect. The article says, crop of startups compete to serve the military market. So crop of startups was not the headline I was looking for. So Ross Perot, in the meantime, had like decided to go create one of these, and a bunch of other people. And we were kind of the main theme of the article, but still there were a lot of startups, and it was stressful. And we were spending a lot of money, and we had a lot of money in the bank. And, back in the day, having $1 million a month burn rate was like not atypical because there was so much more venture capital. Well, we all know what happened around that same time is the market started to have a problem in 2000, early 2000.
Yeah.
And where there's some revisionist history about the bubble bursting is when you're in the middle of that, you don't actually see it as the bursted bubble. What you see is a bobble in the stock market. VCs are like, oh, there's more money, don't worry. And then over some period of time, the full, maybe it's like Chernobyl. It's like they don't really fully understand in the middle of the incident how big an incident this will be. They like talk about the radiation level. They're like, it's not good, but it's not terrible.
Yeah. It's exactly the top of the meter.
Yeah, exactly the top of the meter. Weird. So the bubble burst, and they're like, oh, it doesn't seem that bad. But, well, it turned out to be horrible. And basically what happened is we were hooked on venture capital money. And, I had to, like, cut costs in the company. So I remember being at a board meeting saying we need to spend more. And Dave Liddell's like, I'm like, we're an F-14 on the carrier. We need to be shot off. And he's like, I think you're in Humvee in the desert. So I cut costs. And so basically for the next year and a half, basically, I'm begging venture firms for a little bit of money, and I'm firing people in the company or letting people go. And the first time I do it, I tell people, this is a one-time thing, but then I keep doing it because we are out of money. And at a certain point, maybe like a year later, I'd always said to the VCs, because I was 30 or 31, and I was young to be a CEO. It's not true today, but then it was true. And I'd always say to the VCs, if you have somebody better to be the CEO, I'm always open-minded. And they called me and said, hey, we think that this place would benefit from a more experienced CEO. And they brought one of their operating partners in, or operating people, somebody who I will not mention. And they come in, and I remember one of the most profound moments of my life as this guy is sitting in my seat in my office with all my decorations. Back in the days, we had offices. Yeah. And I was in the guest seat, which was kind of an interesting thing. And he says...
By the way, me too. I've had that exact... All the details, who he gets paid more, or they kicked you out, all the pieces. That's the piece I remember. Like, wait, you're sitting in my chair. Yeah, that's just something visceral about that.
Well, this is cinematic. Right. And he says to me, gray hair guy, PhD, he says, Chris, it'd be better if you don't come by the office anymore. So let's just be clear. This is my company. I created this company. I'm still kind of a meaningful shareholder in the company. I'm on the board. This is my whole identity. My level of insecurity, by the way. So when I was maybe I was a kid, I was kind of an insecure kid. But then in the military, I did pretty well, so I was feeling pretty good about that. But I went to business school, and then I always felt like a little bit like the outsider, like I didn't belong here. It's the imposter syndrome. And military.com at this stage for me was my entire identity in my life, in my fortune, not much of a fortune, but my whole future. And I was basically being asked to leave, and this was being kicked out of the family. This was very, very difficult. But in this moment, and so basically I left, and Ann and I lived in the same apartment complex, Golden Gateway, and there's a swimming pool. And every day for 6 months, I went and swam and thought about where I went wrong. And in this time period, the 6 months of reflection, I remember with incredible clarity, is the most important business education I've ever gotten in my entire life. So basically for 6 months, swimming every day, I thought about all the mistakes that I made to get myself into this position. And in that incredibly painful moment was all of the growth I would say 80% of my growth as a leader happened during that time period of reflection. And it was I can tell you what I learned, but it was a kind of a profound moment.
Is there a key thing that you learned in that?
Oh, yeah.
Swimming in that pool?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. In fact, there's probably like 3 lessons that I think are applicable to people. But maybe I should hold the lessons for 1 second and just give you the postscript.
Yeah.
So the postscript basically was I was still on the board. One of my co-founders was happy that a new CEO was in, and I don't think was very happy about it. But then he said, well, it's not going very well with this new CEO. He's doing a bunch of things we don't like. We're running out of money. And basically we're at a board meeting and we're like talking to bankruptcy lawyers. The former commandant of the Marine Corps was on our board. He said, sometimes it's important to know when to quit. And so basically we were out of money, and this woman, Abigail Johnson, who's a a kind of well-known PR person who's a friend of mine said, basically if someone's going to shoot Old Yeller, it should be you. So I went to a board meeting, and in a kind of surprising statement that even surprises me to this day, I said to the board, why don't I just come back as the CEO and shut the company down or do whatever I need to do? And, at this stage, the gray-haired CEO thought it was just my problem. I think was happy to be out of there.
Yeah.
And the VCs had already written it down to zero. And so I came back as the CEO and basically got rid of 90% of the company, including one of my co-founders. And I was trying to sell the company for $1. Because this is a mission-driven company. It was never about me making money. It was about creating something that mattered in the world. Right. And I tried to sell the company for $1. I talked to Monster. I talked to Yahoo. All these people, and nobody would buy it. And I said to Ann one day, she was running sales and marketing and a lot of other things. I said, Ann, we need $25,000 immediately, or they're just going to lock the doors. I mean, it was way past not paying the bills. And Ann comes back with $25,000, and then basically, over the next 6 months and a year and 2 years, Ann and the company found the revenue model and started funding the company through cash flow. And we turned the company around. It was basically equivalent to taking a 747 nose down, pulling it up, and the tails remaining on the ground, right. But the aircraft is still
Sparking
flying.
On the ground, yeah.
And a couple years later, the company I was trying to sell the company to for $1, they sent their CEO out, Andy McKelvey, who's was a 70-year-old great entrepreneur, the owner of Monster, and he said, I love what you're doing, and would you be interested in being part of Monster? And I said, maybe. He said, how much do you want? And I said, I'd raise $30 or $40 million. I said, well, how about $50 million? And he said, okay. And I said, did I say 50? I meant 100. No. Right. So we sold the company, and back in the day, that was a pretty good outcome, not so much today. And we were part of Monster, and things were going great. We had rehired a lot of people, and then I went and started another company. And actually, I was going to do it with Andy, and Andy had to leave Monster, and it didn't get done there, called Affinity Labs, to do what we did at military, but for nurses and teachers and police officers and government workers. And I started that company, and that went really well. It was a good outcome. And I was pleased to see that experience, because what I did was basically take the mistakes I'd made at military and try to learn from them. And then when you're like, well, I have a new recipe to make the cake. Right. And, I made the new cake with the new recipe, and, the cake worked. Yeah. So I feel good about the things that I learned. And if you want, I'm happy to share.
What are the things that you learned?
Okay. Here's the kind of the key to me. So if you said to me, what were the key mistakes? So there's a meta point here, which is if you're hooked on venture capital money and it's not in the bank, right, you're vulnerable to market conditions. Yep. So when the market turned around, and in 2000 when the market blew up, not only was there no more venture capital, and by the way, that could happen, it could happen. Now there was no more venture capital, but there was no ad revenue really, because a lot of people that were testing ad revenue on the internet were happy that it was going away. Yeah. A&E wanted their money back. I mean, the internet was so disruptive then, I think there was a lot of incumbents that were sort of happy to see this problem. Yeah. So it was a problem across the board, but because I needed more capital, there were a lot of issues. And then I would say morale was terrible. And so thematically, that are not sort of environmental conditions other than, you have to have capital in the bank or else you're beholden to other people. Most of the lessons were related to me and leadership in the company. So I'll just start at the very beginning, which is my insecurity as a CEO and maybe as a human being manifested itself in ways that were not positive for the culture of the company. So for example, I'm a good product person. I know I'm good at product. For example, I think I thought a lot more about myself and being right than I did about other people in the company. And that's a direct result of my own insecurity. And so I made a lot of leadership mistakes. So I would say there's one category relates to leadership. So when we think about a great organization has the right kinds of people. We'll talk about culture in a second. But in my company, I had, maybe I think about it as a 2x2. So if we can do this on a podcast. On one axis is competence, and another axis maybe is trust or fit. So on the top right quadrant are the most amazing people that are incredibly talented, that fit in really well. Stan Chudnovsky, right? Stan is like the nicest human being and also one of the most competent human beings that cares deeply.
Yep.
Top right corner, right?
Yeah.
And Dwane, top right corner, right? The bottom left corner is the devil, right? They're kind of like, well, maybe they're not even the devil because they're not that clever. They're just like not good cultural fits and they're not good at their job.
Yeah.
The bottom right corner might be the devil, which is like, you're good at your job, but you're a real asshole or a problem in the world. Yeah. You know those people. And top left quadrant is, that really nice person that's not great at their job. And you can't get rid of them because you love them. It's like your cousin that's working at the company that gets you coffee every day. I just told my wife how amazing you are. You're like, oh, no. Well, at the company in the early stages, we had people in all of those quadrants. And the problem with the top left quadrant and the bottom right quadrant, bottom right lower quadrant is these people, or maybe any of the quadrants other than top right, are taking away from how those people feel about being at the company. Because if they look around and they see that there aren't great people there or there's a bad culture, they kind of wonder why they should be there. And you certainly can't attract great talent. And I just didn't, I was afraid to fire people that were very talented. Right. I really was. And I was probably afraid to lead them in a way that got them back on board. So that's one category of thing that was problematic. The second is I hadn't really thought about trust as an important component of culture, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when I came back, basically, I had learned that lesson. And now, for example, when I interview people, I talk to them about this. So the old way of interviewing people is to ask them trick questions, and maybe they'll reveal something that shows that they're not a good fit, or maybe that they are a good fit. The new world is you tell people. I learned through my experiences that part of the job as the CEO is to build a culture where people can thrive, but also curate the group of people that can build a great company together. And I have low tolerance for people that aren't willing to do that. Like if you're not passionate, that's a good severance package.
Yeah.
And I get to decide that. And so in this interview, it's important that we figure out whether you can be successful at this job or not. So basically what happens is I change my view around their success. And people kind of can understand that, and they'll have a different kind of conversation with you. So I've evolved. I guess the mistake was I wasn't thinking about that, to evolving to a point where I really care deeply about the people that work in the company and their success. And even at the beginning, to see whether they're going to be part of the right culture. So there was a lot of leadership problems relating to curating that group of people and having the courage to do the right sets of things. Culture probably is at the top of my list. So it's related. And at Affinity Labs and Military.com 2.0, and a little bit at 1.0, but mostly Military 2.0 when I came back, we built a culture of excellence. And a culture of excellence is manifested in one where everyone feels lucky to be there. They look around and like and admire the people that they work with. And there's a kind of sense of dedication, purpose, and mission, and there's high trust. So trust is probably the most important leadership lesson of my life. So if you could have one thing, I guess maybe other than product market fit, that's important. After product market fit, it's trust. And I might even put it higher in the sense that in a culture of excellence and trust, anything is possible. So at the military and Affinity, the team could build anything, really anything. I mean, I really felt that they were capable of that. And, Trust is a great book I would recommend to anyone. It's very short. It's called The Thin Book of Trust. And it talks about the components of trust, and that's competence, care, sincerity, right? So when you talk to someone, they believe that you're trying to tell them the truth. So when I gave feedback at Military 1.0, I think people, I don't know if I think that they saw it as an attack, maybe, or they didn't always trust me. Later on, from a good place in my heart, my feedback was to help them be better people. And if people believe that that's what you're trying to do, it's amazing what you can tell people. Right. It's amazing the kind of direct conversations you can have with people because they think you're in their corner. So building that kind of organization where you can be in people's corner and it isn't about hierarchy, that is kind of, to me, the cornerstone of great companies. And it has to happen early in the company and has to come from the CEO. And if there's problems of trust, there are fundamental flaws in the structure of an organization. So that's my second area. The third area is a kind of mistake that I made more fundamentally around the things that we did in the company. So basically, and I've written a lot about this, I made a mistake of confusing activities with outcomes. Have you heard me talk about this before?
No.
Okay. Do you know the difference between like an activity and an outcome?
Not really.
Okay. Let me give you an example. So when I was starting the company, I basically listened to what the VCs said because I didn't know better. I'm like, well, these people are experts. They've seen a million companies. Okay, that's kind of a mistake for a CEO. So it's important to listen to people, but you need to kind of make up your own mind about whether these things make sense and take everything with a bit of grain of salt. So back in the day, they're like, you need a PR firm. So I hired for $25,000 a month in 1999, Blanca Notice, and they did, I was on the front page of lots of publications. I would say that's an activity. That's not revenue. Right?
Huh?
What are you getting from that? Well, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think sometimes we can do some things that look good, but actually don't move the needle in the company. And that's a real problem, especially for companies that are overcapitalized. So we were overcapitalized, and you might hire really famous UI designers. You might do company offsites. You might do meals. You might do lots of things. And I'm not saying any of these are a problem, but they are not the same as an outcome for the company. And when we ran out of money, we got very focused on, this is the beauty of seed financing, you have to focus on the things that make a difference.
Yep.
So in seed financing, if you do not show traction, you'll have a problem raising your money. So this is, we did billboards, we were doing television commercials, we had all sorts of stuff going on. And I wouldn't do many of those things today. But that lens is not one that I had really considered as we were thinking about things that people were doing. So we got very, very focused on later on let's make sure we're just spending time on the few things that really make a difference in the company. And, that's there's some of that that Eric Ries took into minimal viable product or lean startup methodology. But, still today we have a lot of companies that have been really capitalized. Monster had a big UI lab. Did that really make a difference? Yahoo had a gigantic usability. They wrote usability books. Did that make a difference for them? No, at the end of the day, it really didn't.
Was there a contrast between what you saw in terms of military leadership versus what you saw civilian leadership? I don't know what you'd call that, but
yeah, what's the difference? Well, I will say that from a sort of classical training point of view, one might say that I had very good classical leadership training, meaning I was in the military and I went to Harvard Business School, and you'd think that these things would have made me a really good leader, and I would say they didn't really. They were not sufficient. And because I was not mature enough to understand all of the things, I managed people my whole life, even as a brand new ensign in the Navy, but I didn't really understand these ideas around love of others. I have a love today of other people. I have huge empathy for people, and I want to help people. This idea maybe wasn't integral into kind of who I was as a human. So it was really when I failed as a leader that I had the awareness. It's like the Buddha has his awareness when he starves himself and decides he needs a new way. Sometimes we need the difficulty to really know the truth. And this is the genius of failure, is that the learning opportunities are profound. But there is one important thing that I learned from, I learned many important things from the military, but one that's relevant to all of us maybe listening to this podcast, because I'm assuming most of us are tech people, that the military does something very, very different than the business world, other than their job. And that is, we don't motivate people through money. It's not a lever. We don't have bonuses. There's bonuses, but it's not related to your performance. It's related to, if you re-enlist for some period of time, you might get a bonus. Yeah. We don't have like stock options. So nobody does anything for money. They do things for purpose or mission or maybe recognition. Right? So we're using non-pecuniary reward mechanisms in the military, medals, it's a part of the culture, and it is not a significant part of the culture in business, in my experience. So I've been on a million comp committees. I hate being on the comp committee because basically VCs and a lot of corporate people, they are very focused on very advanced, complicated performance, payment systems. And I just don't believe it. I don't believe that's the primary motivator of humans. And I'm not saying that some people aren't motivated by money, and I'm not saying money isn't important. But what I am saying is we oftentimes neglect the non-financial rewards, thinking we have it solved. Yep. So I've actually only seen bonus programs hurt companies. I've actually never seen them help companies. Mostly people don't make their bonus, or they feel like it wasn't fair. It mostly sets an expectation that somehow the company fails to meet and pisses people off. Much better that people feel valued. Much better that people feel acknowledged. Much better that people feel that they have a boss that they can learn from. I'm incredibly sensitive to these topics. So like, I've been involved in very big companies. My biggest fear in a lot of big companies is bad middle management. Because, you think about that young person or older person that doesn't have a voice in the company, that isn't in the boardroom, that works for a boss that's bad. Yeah. Think about, we all talk about like women or minorities having access to venture capital. Look, this is the 1% world that we're talking about. 99.99% of the world is not in venture capital. They work in companies, and they oftentimes don't work for people that are inspiring or care for them. And this is the great tragedy in the world. And I care deeply about this topic. I think it's just incredibly important that people feel that they have a voice in how they're managed, and that we care about how they're managed. So
that is an unexpected lesson from the military.
Yes,
but it makes sense. I mean, I get it.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I think, I don't know how to get that message, that genetics into these businesses, because it is. We've gotten so kind of financially focused. I think I actually think it's a problem for our entire culture. It won't make us happy. Nobody gets happy on that path.
Yeah.
And in fact, you think about the worst possible manifestation of that. It was like investment banks in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
They treated people terribly, but overpaid them.
Yep.
And it's like there's a kind of hell. There's like a level of hell that looks sort of like that.
Right.
And, I don't know. I think better to live a life of a low-cost structure and work with people you like.
Yep. Well, now you come to this point at long last, to this chapter, where you can design and kind of create your own life, having been successful in business, and you choose, going back to the camera that Anne Dwane gave you, photography becomes something that seems to animate you and that you've become famous for. I mean, in Silicon Valley, you're in some sense the chronicler. In fact, I put up a picture of the guest Alan Powell.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned that I did not attribute this correctly. So I should apologize for that.
Okay, that's okay.
How should someone attribute a photo? And then we'll move on. I just want to know how to do this so I don't think about this anymore.
Well, we had talked about that early on, that I was giving you a hard time on Twitter about it.
Just so you know what he's talking about. I put up a photo of Alan Powell with the podcast that I had gotten off the internet, and I just grabbed the photo and I put it up and didn't think about it again. And I didn't attribute it to the person, which coincidentally was Chris, who had taken the photo. And I realized that most people don't give this a second thought, and maybe they should.
Well, it's an interesting thing because, first of all, photography is probably one of the worst sort of financial rewards of any career. And it's getting worse and worse all the time because there's just a proliferation of photographs, and magazines and stuff aren't really the business models they used to be. And so in general, photographers are sensitive about how their photographs are used because that's a kind of source of income for them. It isn't, making money off of photographs is not my objective. My objective, though, is to do work and be known as doing important work and chronicling people's lives, and also to give people photographs that matter to them in their lives. So basically, I license almost all of my photographs with a Creative Commons attribution license, which is you can use it for free. And in fact, I took those photos because Ellen was going through a difficult time in the lawsuit, and I wanted to make sure that she had really, really good photos. Because oftentimes the press will pick photos that are not always flattering of you, especially if there's something difficult happening in your life. So in a sense, I'm like populating the internet with good photos of her. And my thought is it's fine for people to use it, but I want to be associated with that moment in time, that work of art that Ellen and I created together. So when the photo lives without any attribution to me, I feel like I'm left out of the story. Yeah. And I feel like I want to be part of Ellen's story because I admire Ellen so much.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will change that, and I will be more thoughtful about that in the future. So you become the photo laureate of Silicon Valley. Like, how does this come to be? How does this, like, why does this, and you travel around the world too, and kind of what seems almost like a fantasy life at you do some difficult travel. The poles and amazing places.
Well, so when I finished Affinity in 2008, we sold the company. I thought, what is it I really want to do? So, what's the list of all of us who go on to the next thing? Let's talk about what's on the list. So when you finish your company, on the list is the number one, and it didn't used to be the number one thing, but now the number one thing people do when you wrap up your company is raise a fund. Yeah. So they start a venture firm. Now, it's, you just started a venture firm.
Yep.
Are you kind of a little surprised how many people have venture firms?
A little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of venture firms. So not saying that they won't all be incredibly successful, which I hope they all will be, but there's a lot of them. So one thing is to start a venture firm. And I did that too. So I started Nautilus Ventures, my own money, and I made 100 investments in companies, and I still make a small number of investments. But I didn't think that was going to be my purpose. It was going to be something I was going to basically do to support my friends and their companies. And I thought about, should I start another company? A lot of people said, hey, why don't you start a company or join my venture firm? And I thought, well, I've done 2 companies. They were hard. They were, okay, successful. Do I need to do a third? Why would I be doing a third? Am I doing it because I need to have a platform for who I am as a human? Am I doing it because I need more money? Am I doing it because it's really fun? And I thought, well, I want to think a little more deeply and find something, maybe something that's really going to challenge me on a kind of deeper and more philosophical level. And to me, so I went from being in the military to being an entrepreneur to starting this venture firm. But to me, the unfulfilled area of my life was creativity. Yes, I think products or companies are kind of creativity. But during my time at Military and Affinity, I was taking photographs. And, a photograph to me is a lot like a product in the sense that when I built products at my companies, when they were launched, I felt really good about them. They didn't all work, but it was like you conceived of something and then it became real. And photography is like that, maybe on a kind of shorter term time frame, right? Where I can go, here's the alchemy of photography, Ken. I can take a photograph of you today. It takes 2 minutes. I just took one, actually. Yeah. I'll show it to you tomorrow, and you're going to say, that's a nice photo. I don't know. In like 2 years, you're going to yeah, that was kind of a cool moment. In about 5 years, you're going to think, that was pretty amazing. In about 20 years, that photo is probably going to make you choke up a little bit because this is going to represent a time in your life that was quite important.
I'm actually already there. I have, you took a photo of me when I was working with James Curry and Stan Chebnovsky.
Oh, yeah.
And I've used it without attribution, I guess, now that I think about it, but as my photo for some things. It's kind of too old. It's maybe not.
You look the same.
Thank you.
How long ago was that?
It was probably like 7 years ago.
Uh-huh.
But like when I see that photo, first of all, I think I look really good at it.
Yeah,
I'm proud of myself. And it just, I know what space I was in. I know who, they're not in the photo, but I know where I was and what space was in it. And you're right. I understand.
It's pinned a moment in your timeline. Yeah. This is to me, memories are the currency that matters in our lives. It isn't money. It isn't other things. It's memories. And the beauty of photography is we can capture and preserve those memories forever. And I get infinite joy about making photographs of people that I care about. Because I know that these photographs will end up being very, very important to them. And maybe for some of these people, important historically. And maybe even multi-generationally. So as I think about how I want to spend my time, I think telling stories of people that I admire is a good way for me to spend that time. And because, it isn't just about the photograph. It's about an opportunity to spend time with these interesting people all over the world and to participate in a little bit of their life.
Yeah.
And so this is, it's not a hobby. It's my profession and my life. And so I'm trying to do important and good work. And the big change in photography, since I've been doing it now for a long time, is I've just started teaching, and now I'm leading trips. So I'm taking a bunch of interesting entrepreneurs to Svalbard. Right. And, that's the purpose is not money. The purpose is to have a set of really cool experiences with people that I think I can learn from.
It animates them in an interesting way because we could say, like I have a podcast, so I could say, well, we could sit down and have coffee and catch up.
This is similar. This has a similar element.
Right, or we can have this structure where maybe this will be something important for people to listen to in 5 years. So instead of you going to Paris with your friends, which is great, you're going to Paris to capture it, and you probably go more interesting places than Paris.
Yeah, I was just in Paris. In fact, I occasionally, so I teach photo classes, but occasionally I take classes from well-known photographers, people that I kind of admire, right? So I went and took a class with Peter Turnley, who was probably one of the most famous photojournalists. And, he sent us out every day to get 30 images of Paris. And I had an incredibly good experience. That is not typical. As you know, I normally do adventure photography. So Greenland, North Pole, South Pole, space, underwater, whatever it might be. That's more, outside magazine stuff. But, all of it's of interest to me. So
what if you, Do you ever look back? I listen to my early podcasts. They're ridiculous. Ridiculous. Like, not ridiculous, but, you know, you get better. Like, do you ever look at your earliest photos and just say, I thought they were so good at the time, and now I see so many things?
Yeah, all the time. In fact, you know, a recommendation to all of you out there, you should sign up for Amazon Photos, because they are doing something really cool, and that is they're allowing you to upload JPEG and RAW images unlimited for free. Yeah. No down-resing. So Google did something like this, but they would like basically make all the images like lower resolution. This thing is just high res. So the genius of this is that now I have 20 terabytes for real.
Wow.
Up at Amazon. Actually, some of it's still uploading, but I can see all of because I don't delete any of my photos. I can see all of my photos over the years, and I get a little timeline. Okay. And my early photos, inside of my early photos were enough good photos that I pursued photography in my life. So one of the things I hope with my students is I give them the opportunity to make a couple good photos, and then they get excited about it, right? And then they can do more. But I am horrified at how bad my photographs are from the early days. Yep. And because I didn't really know what I was doing, but I still felt good enough to continue to do it, just like you did. If you did your first broadcast and you hated it, you wouldn't have done the second.
Right.
So it was good enough that you could be motivated by it. And my advice to all of you who are just starting out in photography, be careful of your filter usage. Don't oversaturate your photos. New photographers love to oversaturate.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
It's like when the Mac first came out and you could do different fonts.
Yeah.
And everybody was turning in papers to the professors that everything was bold, underlined, italic, wingdings, like all kinds of
And it's funny,
things.
as you evolve as a photographer, I mean, not everyone's the same, but that people often evolve into simplicity in their images. Yeah. Because in a way, that can be kind of the final stage.
Right. Well, let's finish here. What do you think, what are you learning now about photography or life? Like, what do you think what is the area that you don't know that you're excited about learning? You can't possibly be done learning at this point.
Well, I'm learning all the time. I mean, what's interesting for me in my evolution is basically I'm away a lot, but you know, for 20 years, I basically have coffee meetings with people. People want to talk to me about a lot of things. And normally, well, maybe for 15 of those years, it's like, I'm starting a company. What do you think? Do you want to invest? Can you make intros to VCs? Now, basically, people want to talk to me about a life. And maybe that's me turning 50. I don't know. But they want to talk about living their lives. And it's an interesting idea, and I'm going to take us on a slight tangent. Is it Vivek Wadhwa, I think? There was an article, I don't know, like 7 years ago or 8 years ago on TechCrunch about how like the MBA, we don't need MBAs and we don't even need a college degree. Do you remember there's Peter Thiel had his own thing? Yeah. And you know, it's an interesting idea. And when I was working at Harvard at the time, and one of my mentor professors there, Bill Salmon, he said something very interesting. He said, you know, if your whole objective in your life is to be an entrepreneur, you absolutely don't need any of these degrees. You know, I'm paraphrasing him, so maybe he didn't say it exactly like that. But if your objective is to live an interesting and good life, you might find them useful. And this is something that that you get with age a little bit, is you lose a little of that myopia. When I was doing military, I was all about military. You know, I'm not married. I have no children. I mean, basically, I gave my startups my whole life. Right. It was all about that. But over some period of time, as we get older, we realize it's not really about that. This is just a kind of medium in which to live your life. It's a very rich medium because you can learn a lot. But our objective is to live a happy and good life. Some people might argue, they say maybe it's to give back or whatever it might be. But mostly, I think it's about living a good and happy life, which means more than just being good at your startups or going public. You know, in fact, many people find some success in their startup is a very destabilizing thing because they got what they always wanted, and it turns out not to be about that at all. And I believe that very, very deeply. And so the last 10 years for me has been about learning how to live a life that isn't about the traditional metrics. And it requires some courage because when I was a startup CEO or making a lot of investments, there was a lot of currency that came with that. It was, I was thought of as a good entrepreneur, and people wanted to hire me or whatever, have me start companies with them. And if you let that go, then you're kind of a human. You're just a person out there, and you have to find your own sense of worth. And it's hard to do because we're so status oriented as humans. But in there lies the answers. because at the end of the day, it has to just be about us. It can't be about our jobs and our education and the brands. It's got to be about finding happiness in ourselves. So that's a daily kind of area of learning. Specifically as it relates to photography, I've just signed myself up for a project. I think I told you I'm working on a 3-year project to embed myself in military units as a cultural embed, to tell stories of military people serving today, and to tell those stories of just regular people, because we only hear about people in the extremes. And I'm working with Jim Estrin from the New York Times and Ed Cashy, who was with National Geographic. And these two guys are basically mentoring me on a big, serious photo project. And this is not anything I've ever done before. So I've done a month, in Antarctica, and I've done some longer term things. I've done articles, but this thing is a kind of serious photo project that has a mission and a purpose and lots of products. So it's a kind of job. And so this is being put into a structured environment where I have real deliverables.
Right.
Like, most of us in the world, this is a new area of growth for me. And it's kind of like a long-term book project. You could sort of think of it like that. So that's kind of an area of growth. But every day I just kind of seek to be happy and to make a positive difference in people's lives.
Wow. Well, you've really traveled an amazing path, gone through some amazing chapters. How do people, can people follow your photography in any way or learn about that? Or is that?
Yep. Let's see. You can follow me on Twitter at Chris Michael, Michel, or Instagram. It's unfortunately different, CHRIS_MICHEL. I'm always happy to talk to people about photography.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this. I don't think, I bet most people who started listening to this podcast were not thinking we were going to start in the military and end up with a photographer. But I guess that's why you listen to the podcast.
Who knows what's next?
That's right. Well, thanks so much. My guest has been Chris Michael. This has been the Something Venture Podcast. See you next time.